Cortez wasn't welcomed in a surprisingly friendly fashion because the Aztecs were nice guys. It is instead likely, and most fortuitous, that he was warmly received because the timing of his arrival fell perfectly in line with the prophecies regarding the return of the Aztec god Quetzalcoatl, a nice-ish deity who only required sacrifices of hummingbirds and butterflies. When the group of strange men on horseback, impressively firing guns, arrived at the same time as the expected coming of the god, some of the Aztecs were, at least temporarily, understandably confused. Shortly after their arrival, Cortez's men imprisoned Montezuma II. However, when the Spaniards tried to seize Tenochtitlan, they were met with formidable resistance to the city's forces, who supposedly proceeded to stone their leader to death because of his bad judgment with the feathers and gold and other gifts. From 600 to 1,000 conquistadors died in the ensuing battle, so many that June 30th, 1520 came to be known as La Noche Triste, the Night of Tears or the Night of Sorrows. The Spaniards fled, and the Aztecs rejoiced. Their new leader, Cuauhtémoc, decided never to welcome strangers who were unproven gods to the city again, and life in Tenochtitlan returned to normal for about 10 minutes. The Spaniards weren't with the Aztecs long enough to capture the city, but they were, you guessed it, able to leave smallpox behind. One of Cortez's infected soldiers died during the battle, and his body was looted. The disease spread through the empire and devastated it. By September 1520, the inhabitants of Tenochtitlan had developed racking coughs and painful burning sores. One Aztec account described what was called the Great Rash. Sores erupted on our faces, our bellies. We were covered with agonizing sores from head to foot. The sick were so utterly helpless they could only lie on their beds like corpses, unable to move their limbs or even their heads. They could not lie face down or roll from one side to the other. If they did move their bodies, they screamed in pain. Aztec cities like Texcoco, which was estimated to have 15,000 citizens before the plague, will be left with only 600 people, or 4% of its former population by 1580. Smaller towns and villages would simply be obliterated. Today, it's estimated that smallpox killed around 90% of the native people in the Americas. Even in Europe, where the disease was known, smallpox was terrifying because it was so contagious. Sometimes being in a room next door to someone who was infected was all it took. Smallpox was even more terrifying and deadly to people who had never experienced it. One Spanish priest graphically described that the Aztecs died in heaps. In many places, it happened that everyone in a house died, and as it was impossible to bury the great number of dead, they pulled down the house over them so that the homes became their tomb. When Cortez returned in 1521, he was able to take the Aztec capital with ease. In addition to disease, many died only of hunger, for they had no one left to look after them. No one cared about anyone else. A friar and author of Historia General, who would claim to have buried 10,000 people before he died of smallpox himself in 1590, said that people lived in terror of any contact with their neighbors, much as Europeans had during the bubonic plague, which only killed 30% of the people in Europe. There was worry that the Aztecs' land would revert to wild beasts and wilderness, as there were too few Spaniards to settle it, and the Aztecs would soon be extinct. The few remaining Aztecs began a new calendar, which counted time anew from the year they first experienced the Great Leprosy. This makes sense. The disease was so devastating and the obliteration so complete that their entire world could only be grouped as what came before and what came after. The Spaniards shrugged off the horrors and devastation of the plague, saying, "The matters of the Indies are the judgments of God, and come from His profound wisdom, and He knows why He permitted what happened." That is not a satisfying answer. Why were the effects of smallpox so devastating to these empires? In large part, the high death toll occurred because the Amerindians, prior to the arrival of European visitors, had absolutely no exposure to the kind of diseases that 16th century Europeans considered a normal part of life. Therefore, they had no resulting immunities. That's not to say that smallpox wasn't a scourge in Europe as well. It killed around 400,000 people, many of them children, each year in Europe well into the 18th century. But those surviving the disease developed immunity, and a small degree of immunity could be passed down through parents. Smallpox is thought to have originated in farm animals, especially cattle, but also horses and sheep, and then crossed species to infect humans.